Okay. So, hello and welcome now to the second segment on sustainability and gaming. In the first segment, we talked a little bit about what is sustainability, all right? And, we said, okay, if person A does something related to social equity, something related to economic growth, and something related to the environment, then they are very sustainable. But when I say they did something, how much did they do, right? How do we measure the impact? Is it okay to do a very little bit of a bunch of things, or should you actually get deeper? And how can you tell if somebody is getting deeper into sustainability? So it's very important that we measure, that we figure out ways to measuring sustainability, and to the extent possible indicate, sort of incorporate these in these games, so that when multiple players are playing these games, you're able to say, hey, this player implemented these strategies but went really deep into sustainability and earned so many points. This player also implemented a bunch of strategies, but they were very superficial, and therefore they have not earned as many points, right? And things like this. So measuring sustainability becomes extremely important, all right? There are many measurement frameworks available. I'm not going to, it'll take me hours to go through all of them. I'm just going to provide you a few examples that can jog your thinking, all right? One very popular and very sort of famous framework to measure sustainability is something called the planetary boundaries framework, right? The idea behind the planetary boundaries framework is this: we have a planet, all right, and there are certain aspects that we have to very carefully watch for. Otherwise, our planet, or at least life on this planet, will be destroyed, right? What are these things that we should watch for? There are a bunch of things here. We should look at the amount of fresh water there is on the planet. There might be a large amount of water, but survival is dependent on fresh water. All right. Biogeochemical flows, right? What's happening between the atmosphere, the land, what's happening the geosphere underneath, how are nutrients and chemicals moving up and down? That's something else to look at. So on and so forth. What's happening in the atmosphere? What is the concentration of aerosols and how is that affecting climate, right? Ozone depletion. What is happening to the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere? So there are I believe 9 parameters, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 parameters that are called the planetary boundaries. These are 9 parameters. It's almost like going for a health checkup, right? So when you go for a health checkup, people look at your blood pressure, your temperature, things like that. And if everything is within permissible limits, then you're healthy. If something is not, if you have a very high temperature, then you have fever and you have to be dealt with, right? So similarly, this is a health checkup for the planet. There are these 9 planetary boundaries. And just like your temperature is expected to be 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit and maybe plus or minus a little bit, and your pressure is expected to be 80, 120, things like that. There are boundaries for each of these variables, right? Quantitative boundaries. To the extent to which you exceed these boundaries, the planet is in trouble, right? To the extent to which you stay within these boundaries, the planet is relatively safe. So if you look here at this example, the stratospheric ozone deletion and atmospheric aerosol loading are within control at the moment, according to what is represented here. Whereas the CO2 concentration is, for instance, far more than what the planet can handle. All right. So one option is to have a framework like a planetary boundary framework and sort of penalize people for going above that framework, reward people from being within that framework. There are several frameworks, but the planetary boundary framework could be one that's very popular, very well established. It addresses primarily only the environmental parameters, but that's one start. All right. So that's an example of a framework that you can use to perhaps measure sustainability. All right. Another framework is what we might call the carbon footprint framework, which is to say every activity that we do, and we call them anthropogenic activities because they are activities done by humans, there is a certain amount of carbon that you typically emit, right? So to give you an example, you get into your car to drive from your house to the railway station, right? In that process, the car has taken some fuel, it has burnt that fuel, it's emitted some not only carbon dioxide but also sulfuric oxide and various nitrous oxides and things like that. So there are a number of pollutants that have entered the atmosphere, right? Similarly, if I eat a meal of rice, right? That rice actually was planted somewhere, it was harvested, there was energy used for irrigation, that energy came from burning coal-fired power plants, and therefore carbon dioxide was emitted into the atmosphere to generate that energy for this irrigation to happen. Then once the crop was harvested, it was then transported, same thing, there was a vehicle that brought it, things like that. So almost every activity, right, that we do has something called a carbon footprint, right? And there are several calculators, and you can find them online, that can measure the carbon footprint of various activities, right? It could be, like I said, harvesting, transportation, things like this. If you want to pour some concrete to build a building, how much carbon dioxide are you emitting, and things like this, right? So one of the aspects that could be incorporated into a game is this notion of a carbon footprint, and a view towards saying, look, those activities, certain activities could contribute to higher carbon footprints, other activities could contribute to lower carbon footprints, and can the players strategize and figure out how best to work with low carbon strategies, right? How do you go about measuring this? How much carbon does it take when you went 8 kilometers in your I-20 car from your home to the station or the airport? Well, there are two ways of doing this. One is there are databases that are again available online or electronically that will be able to give you some of this. There are techniques called life cycle analysis, or LCA, where you figure out a system, and it's an accounting method, right? You figure out what are the various activities that are being undertaken here, right? Planting of seeds, irrigation, fertilizer, harvesting, putting it in a cold storage system, transport to some kind of a wholesaler or a warehouse, things like that. So if you take an agricultural supply chain, you've got various parts of that supply chain, and against each part of that you can calculate using some databases and an understanding of how much energy you used and things like that, what could have been the carbon emission. For instance, you could have said, I used 50 watts of power, right, or 50 units of power for my irrigation. Therefore, given that 1 unit of power will emit certain amount of carbon dioxide, which comes from various databases, this is the amount of carbon dioxide I emitted. If I used 100 units of power, I would have emitted twice the amount of carbon dioxide. And you can see how you can now have people trading off, right, and say, hey, I'm going to put in solar panels so that I actually don't burn coal, right, and I am therefore a little bit, my carbon footprint comes down. But if you go back to the triple bottom line, economically I'm worse off because I had to spend more for putting these these solar panels up there. And these are interesting trade-offs that can make a game really interesting. But carbon footprint can be one objective way of calculating how well players are doing in a game with regards to strategy, and to be able to say, hey, you scored 62 points because of your carbon reduction strategy, whereas you scored only 28 points. And you can get to that level of granularity because you can put numbers on carbon emissions and work on them. All right. Similarly, there are things like water footprint. Let me take that example of rice again, right? Rice, paddy, etc. requires quite a bit of water, right? And therefore you can actually calculate per ton of paddy how much water was consumed, right? So you can see here several crops: barley, wheat, sorghum, millet, and this sort of database or website tells us a little bit about how much water went into each of these. And water again is something that we have to carefully preserve, right? Things like beef, because you have to feed the cow, you have to grow the produce, you've got to feed the cow, you've got to let the cow drink, etc., right? So a kilogram of beef or something like 100 grams of beef, I think require a lot of water, right, compared to other sort of things. All right. So again, you can objectively measure the water footprint of a particular process, and it's not just related to agriculture. You can say, if I sort of construct a building made out of concrete, here is the amount of water that I will need. If I constructed the same amount of building with steel, here is the amount of water that I would need. So depending on choices that people make in your game, they can be evaluated based on how well they are within the planetary boundaries, how well they are doing with their carbon footprint, and how well or poorly they are doing with regards to their water footprint. Just to name 3 examples. I'm not saying you should stick to these, there are many others, but these are probably 3 ideas on how you can measure sustainability, and therefore there is a way in which you can reward and penalize people during these games. All right. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of how you think about measurement, at least as far as games and gamification is concerned. So we'll stop here with this module. Thank you.